Helenus was a uh, one of the princes of Troy. There were 50 princes of Troy, and Helenus was a brother of Hector. He was a high priest of Apollo, and so he lived in the temple of Apollo. So he was there most of the time. Um, he might as well have lived there because he was always there. And Achilles would be entering the Apollo's temple. Was one of the first places he desecrated, or he would smack the head off the statue of Apollo and anger him. And when the when Troy was going to be sacked, um, there was a dinner that was had, and at the dinner table was Priam, the king of Troy, with Hector, the the main prince. He would become king of Troy someday. Hector would, and Helenus wouldn't always eat dinner with. He was one of the princes that wasn't really the most popular one. He was a younger prince, younger brother, and so he only ate dinner sometimes with the main body of who ate dinner. It was always Hector with his dad and the famous people, stronger people. But Helenus would get to eat dinner sometimes with his dad and his brother. Like it was like a occasion, because he didn't eat dinner with them often when they were having dinner and planning their Trojan plans. But Helenus had understood some concepts which were important to understand about the relationship between the divine feminine and men, or the ego. So he understood that the relationship had to be nurtured in so much as the interest of a woman to a man also sparked the interest of that man to the woman, so that it take two people to actually want to talk to each other in order for it to happen in a way that it wasn't uninteresting for one of them. Many interactions we have with people, especially men to women, are well, it's usually one way. The woman wants to talk to the man, or to get the attention of the important man, but the man doesn't really have an interest to talk to her. Often, the interest that we have to talk to somebody is only one way. One person wants to talk to somebody who doesn't really want to talk to him, and so it's ultimately that one person will try to get the attention of someone else or need it, and the other person won't want it as a result. So if two people are going to talk to each other or interact because you need someone's attention too much, it may be that they don't want your attention as a result. So being too needy on somebody could be a way that it could be detrimental to your natural desire as a human being to want to have someone's attention. You desire to get the attention of somebody. Well, as a result, it may be that the intensity of your desire to get that attention from somebody actually causes them not to want to talk to you, or even they're not interested as a result. Now, it's just a kind of an unfortunate way that humans will relate to each other, and sometimes in big ways, where it's unfortunate for one party or one side, because it's just about people who need the attention of others and who don't get it back, but also get feelings that they're not wanted, or that in fact they're not liked. So because you need someone desperately, it may be that you will not only experience that person doesn't need you, it doesn't even want you, and in fact you'll have feelings then in response to that you're not wanted, or you won't feel good, you feel bad, you feel terrible. And so it's important to know that important people, or important men who were always wanted their attention was always wanted. Important people like Hector or Priam, people want to talk to them all the time, and people like to eat dinner with them. It was always like do we get to have be lucky enough to have their attention, and ultimately they would tend to either give you that attention or not give it to you. And so sometimes it could be a problem when people don't understand really what they're doing. Ultimately, you don't want to be too desperate when you want to get someone's attention, or if you get someone's attention, you don't want to truly have too much of a reaction, like as if it can cause them not to want to even talk, not to even want to talk to you. Helenus, he understood that the goddess, or let's say the divine feminine heart, her heart, she would be prone to not want to talk to you because you want to talk to her really badly. Also, because if you didn't want to talk to her, he was also aware that that may cause her to want to talk to you. So men and women will play games with each other. And by trying to deny someone on some level, you can cause them to maybe either deny you as well, or maybe actually want your attention as a result instead. It's called mind games, or playing games, head games. And people who play these head games, well, ultimately nothing could come good from it, because ultimately somebody's going to be really upset about it and probably not get what they want. And if someone else will feel extra overly important and think they already have everything they need. It causes egotistical behavior, and not just in men, but in women. Helenus didn't want to deny a woman just because he already was aware that to deny her may be an advantage. It may cause her to feel more needy, or needing that attention. And he was aware that a lot of people did play those kind of head games where they deny each other and feel self-important. And sometimes it would happen on both parties, where all that would happen really is that a man would deny a woman and feel self-important, and the woman would just deny that man back and feel self-important. And then you have no communication between two parties. And this could happen on a level where it's happening to everybody. Rather than people wanting to talk to each other, that you have people not wanting to talk to each other, or feeling self-important, not wanting to talk to each other, and denying each other their attention. It can cause a whole community of people to be messed up, or even become ridiculous. Helenus fought with his brother in battle on many occasions, and he was a priest, though, so he was not a fighter. And ultimately he was a fighter. He fought with his brother, and not only did he fight with his brother, but he fought in some pretty hairy battles. Once he had a chance to take Mount Menelaus out. So he was actually involved with some of the key battles where he had a chance to actually fight with some characters of the other opposing forces, and played an important role in it. But only a couple times did he actually have the chance to engage in quite legendary battle. And for the most part, he was not even in any of the battles otherwise. So there was one instance where Helenus had been in battle with his brother Hector, and he had an arrow that came from Menelaus, the king, who was shooting arrows, and ultimately some of his men, and he took an arrow through the elbow, which pinned his own bow to his elbow. So his elbow was pierced by an arrow, and he was holding a bow in his hand when it happened. So the arrow that pierced his arm pierced his bow too. So he got his arm and his bow pegs stuck together by the arrow. So he now couldn't fight, and he couldn't, and he had a bow stuck through him. He couldn't get the bow off his hand. It wouldn't fall to the ground. The arrow went through the bow and through his hand, and so the bow and his hand were pierced by the arrow together. That would have been a factor for why he was not going to be fighting a lot of battles, and so he would be out of battle for quite a while. because he not only was a priest of just the temple, but he was also expected to stay in the battle, except for the injury that he incurred. The injury that happened to him was it took a while to heal, and it put him out of the battle. So he went back to the temple and spent a lot of time while Troy was fighting, just back at the temple. During the Trojan War, there was a lot of failure to communicate between the sides, and so that when Minerva, the goddess, wanted to send messengers, and she did, she could send them just by sending people to go tell them physically, or with some kind of a physical note or message, and often she would use Helenus. The reason why she used Helenus was she would use Helenus as a personal messenger. Now, that wasn't necessarily the way to do it, because ultimately the way that they did it was just sending messengers. It could be anybody with messages, but Minerva picked Helenus and ultimately had messengers contact him at the temple, and he was aware that she wanted to talk to him. So if you can imagine that Helenus is just a younger brother of Hector, and he's always kind of fighting for attention. Like, he doesn't get to be the important guy a lot, except that he's by himself in the temple doing his temple stuff, which isn't really feeling that important. But then he finds out that she's interested in actually using him as a messenger or wanting to talk to him. So he finds this out through messengers that come to his temple, basically tell him that the goddess Minerva wants to make contact with him. Well, certainly he's interested immediately, because he's also kind of in disbelief, because he'd take any chance to do something like that, because like he's basically having a relationship with Apollo, the sun god, and what he would say to you, or what would be in the story of what you would need to know about a high priest and his god that he serves and lives in the temple. Like, he was the highest priest, and so there was nobody higher than him, and he had a relationship with his god that he enjoyed. It was a private kind of privilege, which meant that he talked to the god Apollo. And it's important to know that Apollo didn't show up and talk to anybody. He certainly might if he felt like it, but Apollo often was never seen by anyone. He was only felt through his wrath, meaning you never saw Apollo. You never saw him. If he was just a god that was heard of and known. But if something happened, then you'd know what he did if he did something. But like, he caused a plague, he might do that, or he might shoot arrows from a mountaintop at an army and cause that our whole army to be in distress. But you'd never see him, you'd never hear him, you'd never know that he was really actually there by any kind of witnessing it. So the actual way that gods back then would deal with people are only show themselves to the people that were important or privileged, and other people would just have to have some relationship with those gods, knowing that they're real, but they wouldn't be seen. And so you would ultimately depend on the high priest as to what's really going on. Like, do you actually see that god? Well, he would have said yes, and I hear him too, because he shows up to me. But that's something that would have been private. I'm just mentioning this because it's important to know that you might not think that being a priest of Apollo is any kind of reward, and it might be a boring job, and you might think like it's not even something you'd want to do, right? Because you just have to like sit in a temple and like pray to him and make sacrifices to him, and basically it's like, why would you want to be a priest? Well, that's why I would tell you this, and I'm sharing this because or it's important that I share this, because when you would think of, I don't really want to be a priest, or there's nothing good about it, I mean, what is so good about it? Well, what's good about it is that a priest is going to be actually privileged with having a relationship with that God, that God's actually going to show himself, and he'll see that God, or perhaps at least hear him on some level, that it makes the priest's job worth the while, but even something he wants to do. Like, he's glad that he has the privilege of actually being having a personal relationship with that God. And to him, it's the most important thing in the world. There's nothing that could be more important, and he wouldn't choose to want to do anything else. And that, for that reason, it's important to mention that the privileges of a high priest are, well, to anyone that doesn't care to actually have an actual relationship with that God, where you get to talk to him and he comes to talk to you and you see him or you hear him. Well, that's what I'm saying. It becomes like that. The only thing you wanted to do, the only thing important to you. And so he loved to be a priest, and he loved to have a relationship with Apollo. I mean, he knew that people didn't see Apollo or hear Apollo's voice. He also was aware that that they needed him, and also looked up to him, and thought he was the great high priest, because yeah, they knew he was the guy that was like friends with God. And it would ultimately be God wasn't your friend, but he would be friends with the high priest. So you'd go to the high priest to have a relationship with God. You'd have to go through the high priest. That would be the privilege of the high priest. Why you'd even want to be one is because everyone would want to be one, right? It's important again to mention that, why I would say this, because or why I would mention that, because you'd have to know that everyone wants to be a high priest. Who wouldn't? You know, you'd get to have God actually talking to you and coming in your room, visiting you, but no one else. And you would also see and hear and smell that God, perhaps, like as if like in a real way, like he walks in the room, like, yeah, like, wow. So the Apollo would also give a lot of respect and admiration to his high priests. Like, he would literally tell them, "You are something special to me." And so Apollo respected his high priests and loved them, and ultimately told them that, like, "You're somebody special to me. You are somebody that counts, and understand you're doing an important job, and I'm glad that you're my priest." And that makes the priest really feel like, wow, okay, well, yeah, I wouldn't pick anything else. I wouldn't want to do anything else in the universe. And a lot of people just think of a high priest as like just a boring, like, why would you want him to do it? Well, that's why. And so because of the relationship between Helenus and Apollo, Apollo is the type of god that would protect his priests. And if you did something against one of his priests, well, he would be mad, and then he would do something, like, for instance, when the Greeks or the Achaeans kidnapped, when Agamemnon kidnapped the daughter of one of the high priests of Apollo, who was carrying Apollo's scepter. That high priest had the courage to go to the army himself. Like, he walked out there himself. I mean, he shouldn't have done it because it was dangerous. Like, a man who was a high priest of Apollo had the guts to go out there to the Achaean army and actually walk out to them. Well, ultimately, it's a death sentence and your death wish to think that you could be the enemy, but you're going to actually be going to go out to them. Yeah, they're just going to kill you, or arrest you, and you'd be prisoner to them. So it's not something that the high priest should have done. It's not even something that would have been reasonable to do, because you wouldn't want to go out and face your enemy and right to their face. But he had the scepter of Apollo, which meant, when you read the story and you're reading the story, there's many things that you don't know, that they don't explain to you, that cause people who are reading the War of Troy to kind of miss a lot. And some of these things that they miss are so important not to miss, that, in fact, because the story doesn't provide some of these details, it makes it so that it's almost sad that if you can see more or read more into a story, it's important to know that the person who can read more into a story, who has the ability to read more into a story, provide extra details, it could make it more valuable than anything in the world. Those extra details are so much more valuable; they're invaluable. So this priest or there was a priest that was one of the high priests of Apollo, who wasn't Helenus, but he was another high priest, and he went to the Achaean army out there, and it was really kind of stupid, because they probably would have killed him, and that would have been the kind of common reaction for, "Don't come out here to us, like you're dumb, you want to die." Ultimately that's what he did. But he had the scepter of Apollo. He believed in his God, and he knew his God because he talked to his God. So this scepter to him was very honor. Like, it was not only his protection, but he believed in it. He talked to Apollo. That God shared his company with him, but not with everyone else, in fact. So why he had the courage to do it, a lot of it was because the faith that the priest had was unshakable, and he didn't think the scepter wasn't powerful. He knew it was a real scepter of the actual god Apollo. So he went to the Achaeans with the extra courage, like, yeah, don't tell me my god's not real. And then he went out there and said to King Agamemnon, he tried to take the company of King Agamemnon. So he went to whoever was there, the guards, and he said, I would like the company of King Agamemnon. I have a message for him, and I hold the priest, a high priest, a scepter of Apollo, the sun god himself. So the Achaeans that were approached by him within his scepter, well, they knew the sun god Apollo was real, and they did respect it. So that they were like, okay, like you're wanting to seek company with the king, like, and you're claiming you're holding the scepter of Apollo, the sun god himself. Well, the people that actually were told this, they took it seriously. Like they knew who Apollo was and that he was real. So they were like, okay, well, we'll go tell the king. Basically, it was enough that scepter got him acknowledged, because if you try to get company of a king or the audience of a king, if you actually request it, well, it's not going to happen. It certainly will never happen. And the reality that you would actually have the guts to go to the enemy and go out to your, yeah, it's just preposterous to think that they would not kill you on the spot and say, like, you're an idiot for coming out here to even think. But because Apollo was real and the scepter was real, they took it seriously, and they went to go bother the king to tell him there is a high priest of Apollo out there that is claiming he wants audience with you, and he's holding the scepter of Apollo. So the people that reported this message to King Agamemnon, they did understand it to be an important thing, and that they respected it. But King Agamemnon had Zeus as his god, not Apollo. Apollo was Zeus's son. So Zeus was a more important god, and it was a father god, and Apollo would be a son god, the son of Zeus. So Agamemnon was not thinking that his god, his son, was not as important, or he had thought, well, I have Zeus, I'm King Agamemnon, and Zeus. So high priest is coming with his son. That's just his son. He devalued Apollo in many ways, like as if not as good as Zeus. So he didn't really have respect for that scepter, even though he knew it was real, because he felt the protection of the god he had was Zeus, and Zeus let Agamemnon be the king, in fact. So that Zeus had the support of, or excuse me, King Agamemnon had the support of Zeus entirely. So he wasn't afraid to say, oh, so you mean my god's son his high priest wants some company with me or audience? So he didn't really, he said fine, but he was already in a, I've got your dad. Don't come and think that you can, that his son, or he's a lesser god, to him. So the priest got audience with him and said that you've got my daughter, and I if you let her go, then I won't pray to my god Apollo that you all die, and because she's my daughter and she's a priestess, you can't do this to her. You have to let her go. And ultimately it was a big, bold claim that was preposterous. And if you wanted to see it that way, that the high priest of Apollo could go to King Agamemnon and say, like, well, I have the scepter of Apollo. If you don't give my daughter back, I ask you, please, because she's a good girl and she didn't do anything wrong, and she shouldn't be like kidnapped and then taken, and then you're going to make Apollo mad, and Apollo is going to like really come back at you and might hurt you or kill you. And ultimately King Agamemnon thought it was almost silly, because he thought, like, I've got Zeus as my god, and like you're telling me that his son is going to be punishing me for taking a woman that I took as my own because I am king and can do it. And ultimately it was like, and that scepter, you think that scepter is going to do anything? Basically that was what he was telling, basically he was just, no, he's not going to even acknowledge that high priest. But he told him, you're lucky you're not dead right now. You're lucky you're not you're lucky we didn't kill you already, but it's preposterous to think you're going to come out here and tell me, the king of the Achaeans, and all the whole world practically, that anything, like you're a dumb idiot. And of course he was crying, and he said, she's my daughter and I love her. You can't do this. And he's like, well, I can do whatever I want. I'm the king. I'm King Agamemnon. And so basically he cried, and he said, and the king Agamemnon said, I'll kill you right now if I feel like it. And basically the Zeus, I guess, stayed Agamemnon's anger. And basically he said, you better get the hell out of here right now before I decide to kill you. So he was just crying, and he left. Well, he got back to the temple, and everyone would find out what happened, and Apollo would find out what happened. Sun god Apollo, and he'd be pissed. So Apollo was the type of god that loved his high priests, and ultimately they lived for him, and they would do anything for him. Their whole lives were dedicated to their god, and ultimately Apollo got word of what happened, and he was so angry that he sat up on a mountaintop for 9 days and fired off plague arrows at the Achaean army, killing not only them all day, but the entire army they lost thousands perhaps of men were killed by Apollo. Apollo just sat up on the hill firing arrows off, killing men, cattle, goats, everything, and then into the ships, firing arrows into the ships. So they were getting attacked by a god now. And ultimately it was the way that the Apollo dealt with King Agamemnon for trying to disrespect his priest. So that was something that kind of behavior was something not common to Zeus, meaning Zeus was a type of god that was not going to protect you, like as in fight your battles for you, because he would have you fight your battles for yourself and then give you support. So Zeus was not a type of god that would actually fight your battles for you. He would help you fight the battles, your own battles, and I'll help you fight them. But Apollo was the son of Zeus, and he was a little different from his dad. He would actually fight battles for those that he loved. So it was very common for Apollo, the sun god, to fight your battle for you, because he would say, yeah, that made me mad, and I'll just take care of it for you, and I'll go kick their ass. And that wasn't a behavior of Zeus. That was behavior of his son Apollo. So Helenus was a high priest of the temple of Apollo, and he was really so dedicated to Apollo that Minerva could see it. The goddess Minerva could see what Minerva hated. All the Trojans. She wanted to kill them all, and that was what the whole war was about. It was like a wanting a genocide of the Trojans. She wanted every last Trojan to die, and it ultimately had everything to do with the Trojan egotistical behavior of men who had their god Zeus, the most high god, who was. So you couldn't get any better than having Zeus as your god, because if you did, then it wasn't one of his sons who were also gods, but Apollo and Eris were lesser gods in a sense, being the sons of the greater god Zeus. Minerva knew and saw the dedication, both the dedication of the Trojans in that they either respected the divine feminine or rejected it. They either abused it, attacked it in some cases. Some drunken behavior of the Trojan men, and some of the Trojans would be, abusive towards women that had the goddesses. So like a Trojan man who would drink alcohol and be stupid and, beat his wife. Well, that was rare, and it was not really common. The Trojan mentality was not to beat your wife, it was to love her. But there might be a few Trojan men that were actually being stupid, and they would beat their wife, who was a goddess. And then she would see all that. She would look and see, as a goddess, she could see everything. She could see everything they were doing as a whole Trojan society. She could also look individually at men, what they were choosing to do. And she saw that Helenus was a Trojan that was, not like the other Trojans, and he was a prince of Troy. He was not like his other brothers in many ways, in that he was definitely respectful towards her. So understand that the Trojan men on a whole, especially the 50 princes of Troy, who were like popular movie stars, uh, the princes of Troy enjoyed like a kind of like a movie star status in the Trojan city. You know, if you were one of the 50 princes of Troy, well, you were just a movie star all the time. You know, and the so people really like always wanted to see them. It was always like something going on. You know, one of the princes of Troy, yeah, and Helenus or Helenus, he was he was a high priest, so he didn't have that kind of role of I'm a movie star, like because I'm busy in the temple all the time. I'm with I'm doing stuff with Apollo, the sun god, and my brothers, all the other princes of Troy. Well, they're either fighting as fighters. They have Zeus as their god or Mars as their god, and they're not dedicated to. They're not a priest. You know, most of the princes of Troy were not priests. They were fighters and soldiers. And Helenus was also a soldier, but he was dedicating his entire life to Apollo, the sun god, and his priesthood. And Minerva saw the behavior of the Trojans in that they were very egotistical and tended to deny their wives or not give them the recognition that Minerva demanded that they give them, that in fact you respect your wives because it may be me coming to you. And ultimately it was that case that she had deemed it too bad. The Trojans have to all be slaughtered now, and we have to have Troy fall because there's too many Trojans that are disrespecting the goddesses. And unfortunately for the Trojans, there was enough of it. And also some of that animosity was in the goddesses themselves, which meant that it wasn't so much that the Trojans were being so wrong or bad in that they were being egotistical or not giving their wives equality, or maybe just dismissing their wives, saying, well, you're not a goddess or you're a woman. Don't think you could tell me what to do. Ultimately, the goddesses wanted to influence Trojan society too through women that would try to influence their husbands. And unfortunately for the Trojans, who had a full support of Zeus and Mars, their two gods, they were loved by Zeus. Zeus loved his Trojan men. In fact, the Trojans were favored. Zeus favored the Trojans above all things. Those are my men, and I like them best. But the goddesses not only hated them the most, but probably had something to do with the fact that their father Zeus loved them so much. Well, Minerva was a daughter of Zeus. She was a goddess that really hated the Trojans, and it was for the reason that her father might have loved them so much that she hated him so much, and also had everything to do with the fact they would not recognize women as goddesses any more than Zeus himself would recognize his own daughter as a goddess. Minerva was the daughter of Zeus, and she wanted to be important to her father, who was the god of high gods. Well, the god Zeus would say, daughter, you're just my daughter, and you can be a goddess, but don't expect me to consider you an equal. And that would be a behavior that the reflection onto the Trojan men, as they loved Zeus as their best god and Mars. So they would reflect that kind of behavior. Unfortunately, it was Zeus's behavior they were reflecting. So they had their god and they acted like their god in many ways. To goddesses, it wasn't going to be okay. So they would have to destroy Troy for the fact they denied women. Now, there was an instance where Minerva had been looking closely at all the Trojan men, every single one of them individually, like the whole lot of all of them. It took her a while to see each one. She wanted to see if there were any men in Troy that could be even looked at as savable, because she was considering sacking the entire city and killing them all. She wanted to see, was there anybody that was there that any men that could even be okay still? Well, unfortunately, because of the mentality of soldiering and being a soldier, if you weren't a high priest of some god, or if you weren't a priest, well, it's not likely that you wouldn't be as a whole in a collective kind of feeling the same way. All the men felt the same way, that like their god. And unfortunately, Zeus looked at his daughter as his daughter, not a goddess. So they would look at their wives as not a goddess, and don't try to think you could be one. Well, even if you are. And so that was unfortunate for everyone, including the Trojans, Zeus, and Minerva, because it was like she demanded to be looked at as something divine and respected. And unfortunately, the Trojan men could only see her as a daughter. or a wife that could be a daughter at best, but not a goddess. Helenus was a high priestess and one of the 50 sons of one of the 50 princes of Troy. So he was an important guy for being not so important he's more like a priest. He fought, but he only fought sometimes, and they made him fight sometimes. So he went to war with his brother Hector many times, but not many times. Ultimately, he got injured, and when an arrow pierced his arm, and his bow got actually nailed to his arm, and that injury caused him to be put back in the temple, and where they didn't expect him to fight anymore, just because it was like kind of an official thing, like the rules are that just because you're a high priestess or because you're a high priest of Apollo doesn't mean you can escape duty fighting for your country. So ultimately, for a long time before this injury, they would expect him to fight at least once in a while. He'd have to do it. But his injury caused them to let him off, only thought to be temporarily, meaning he wasn't supposed to be let off. You have to fight with us, at least sometimes, at least on occasion, at least twice a month. You have to come to battle with us. So he did that for a long time. He'd go to with Hector. He fought right along his side, and he was certainly a capable fighter, absolutely. But he was a priest, not a fighter. So it was like twice a month instead of every day. And when he got injured, they said he could take the month off. And then it led to, with the influence of goddess and also Apollo, the gods and goddesses had thought, especially Minerva, she thought there's one man in the whole Trojan society. There's one man, and there might have been more than one man. A few of them. She actually picked them all, took the time to find them all. She didn't want to genocide a whole place. She didn't want to kill every man. If she didn't want to kill anybody innocent, she wanted to spend time trying to find out, like, is there any men that are worthy that will give me the time of day? Well, Helenus was a high priest that gave her the time of day. Not only did he give her the time of day, but she would go to him just to test him, to say, like, let me find one Trojan that deserves to live. And well, he didn't know that. He was not aware that he would be tested, or she was trying to figure that out. He only knew that he loved Apollo, and he was dedicated to his God, who showed up to him and talked to him every day, and he felt very privileged. So he was dedicated, utterly dedicated, and he was not of the collective mind of the fighting element of Troy, just because of his priestly duties did not allow him to take on a fighter kind of mind exclusively, except when he's in battle. So he was skilled in doing things that even soldiers weren't skilled in, perhaps, like shifting from a priestly duty type of role into a different mentality of fighting as a warrior. He could do it, but really the warriors couldn't do it, but it really didn't matter because they wouldn't do it. You see, they didn't like let go of the persona they always were all the time. But yet, because he was a high priest of Apollo, he had to learn how to let go of his mentality in the collective of soldiers. Like, I can't always be a ruthless killer. I have to be a priest and be a loving, tender, kind dad or brother or anything that a priest does. Counseling, helping. So he could do it, and he would shift from one mentality to the other. So when he was in the temple, he was not a soldier. He would shift out of that mentality. He would not be on his collective, so he was not sharing a common spirit with his brothers that were all princes of Troy. He was actually having to separate from that common spirit and then be of a new one, his own. If you're a priest, then anybody wants to be of this one or whatever it is. It won't be of the fighting one. So he would learn how to kind of be a loving person that was really loving, actually, even though he was a tough soldier. He had compassion, empathy, and sympathy for both women that were just thought to be daughters of Troy. He actually respected the goddess partly because she was demanding it and he could feel it, and also because he was a priest more than he was a soldier. He actually could feel it and also thought it should be the case because he agreed with it, because she was a goddess and she was only demanding what was the truth. If she's a goddess, then she should be respected like one. And ultimately, because she was also a daughter of Zeus, well, then she was a goddess that was not on the same level as her father, who was a god who the Trojans had, and therefore also felt like, and the collective of the Trojan men fighting were kind of like their Zeus, their god, and they didn't see her as really equal. So fortunately for Helenus, being the high priest, and being out of that spirit of the fighting mentality into the priest spirit much better, he would actually give her respect, and she would go test him to see like if he needs to die with the rest of the Trojans. And she would come to him, and ultimately he would not only give her respect, but he would get on his knees and bow down to her and say like, well, he knows who she is. So he knew what she was, and their first encounter is not in the Iliad, but there is an encounter in the Iliad where she and he encounter each other when she tells him to give a message to her brother and her father. So there is actually a story where those two actually come together in the story. You could read it, but this is actually another occasion where they came together. It was the first time they came together, and it wasn't in the story. So she wanted to see if he was worthy to die with the rest of the Trojans, and so she went to test him. She went to the temple of Apollo, and basically showed herself. Well, he certainly bowed down to her immediately and knew who she was, and so he gave her a bit of respect, 100%. And she was shocked. She was absolutely shocked because she said, like, "You're not a Trojan. Ultimately, I'm a high priest of Apollo, and I am a Trojan. And so don't think I'm not." And so truly, she's like, "You're not. Like, you're nothing like the collective mind of those Trojan men that I'm going to kill them all, basically. And those are your brothers." So she went and told him that she was going to kill all of Troy and sack it. He believed her 100% because he knew who he was talking to, and he was in much fear for his brothers and Troy itself, because he knew absolutely that oh my God, like I didn't expect you, goddess, to come to me. He was not expecting to ever see her or hear from her, because he was only going to be having some interaction with maybe Zeus or Mars, or Troy had gods that were men. They didn't have goddesses. Athena was their goddess, but certainly it wasn't Minerva. And even Athena, the temples wasn't what he was doing. He wasn't a high priest of Athena, but he did respect her on a level that shocked her. And she told him that the men of Troy will not respect her on the level she needs it, and they're just disrespectful, and it's even worse than that they look at her as nothing. Like, they don't listen to a goddess when she comes in the room. They don't bow down and say, "I know who you are." They say, like, "What do you want?" My God wouldn't see it this way. So she said she told Helenus that she was gonna kill every last Trojan man, and every one of his brother, his father. She told him, "Your dad, your brother, they are all gonna die." He was very scared, but he said, "What can I do?" Well, you can tell them that they better change. There's 10 years in this war. They better change what they're doing and start to realize that I'm nobody to mess with, and I'm a goddess, and you better give respect to your wives and treat them with respect like they are potentially me, because I might come in and talk to you through one of your wives, and you better know who I am. And the thing is they did know who she was. That's what she got so mad about, is that it wasn't that the Trojan men didn't know who she was. Well, they did, and whenever she tried to influence Trojan society and be a part of it, the sad thing was that the goddesses would be okay with Troy if they could influence Trojan society and be a part of it. If they could be a part of it because they could influence it, then they are interested in its existence and its reason to keep existing. But because pretty much no goddess could even get into the society or influence it, and they tried many times. There was no feminine power in that society, and they didn't have goddesses other than Athena, who was a warrior goddess and as a fighter herself too. She was just her dad Zeus had come out of his forehead, so Athena was just her dad Zeus. So in having the Trojans worship a goddess, they were getting a version of their dad in a woman, which is just her dad still. So Athena wasn't having all the problems with the Trojans that Minerva was, and Minerva didn't have her dad at all. She had Mars, and that's what empowered Minerva. So Mars was a version of what Hector had. Do you see? So Minerva, being Minerva the goddess, was not the same as Athena, who had her dad Zeus. So Athena was a Zeus goddess, so would act like Zeus, and Minerva was a Mars goddess who would act like Mars, and Mars was had by every Trojan man. Now Mars and Minerva got along well, and Mars had liked Minerva and respected Minerva, and therefore the Trojan men who had Mars also loved their wives and respected their wives, but as daughters, not as equals or as could be goddesses. But Mars actually did acknowledge Minerva as a goddess because she used him, not Zeus, to become her goddess self. So the goddess Minerva had nothing to do with her father Zeus or his spirit, in the sense that I don't have my dad, I won't take him because, yeah, he doesn't even respect me as a goddess, other than to say that he knows I am his daughter. And so basically she said, I have Mars. So that would be a version of one of the sons of Zeus. So the god that made Minerva a goddess was not her father, it was Mars. Or it could have been Eris, but she would have said no. That's why we got rid of Eris. But it could have been Apollo. Yeah, it could be Apollo too. But if it was Apollo, it wasn't like Mars or even like the Trojans, because Apollo was not a war god whatsoever. He was certainly capable of war at any time, and he could fight war just as good as any war god. But Apollo was dedicated to an entirely different set of interests instead of fighting and just fighting. So, but it could do it. Certainly, Apollo could join in and be as war god as anyone else. But his rule was, I'm not a war god. I'm a god of the sun. And ultimately it would be incorporating the feminine in there everywhere as wives and daughters, with much respect and love, but truly not seeing them as goddesses as well. So even Apollo may have said, well, yeah, we love them and we cherish them, but ultimately he never had to even deal with this idea that there's a problem. Until the Trojan War, there was no problem. So because Mars actually gave full attention to Minerva as you are a goddess, I believe it. So Mars would have said, it's obvious to me that Minerva is got me. She's got my spirit, and yeah, she may have it, and I'm glad she has it, because it makes me feel good too that she's going to take my strength and become herself with her goddess ability. Minerva's nothing more or less than, and ultimately that would be what the Trojans would say, because she was ultimately using Mars to be her powerful goddess self. She was using the god Mars to become the the goddess Minerva. That's how she did it. Otherwise, she couldn't be a strong fighter. She was trained in the battle. She was a sword fighter that could kick your ass. She was as good as any man, and maybe as good as maybe some gods. But her ability to fight and be kind of a battle goddess, was Mars. It was exclusively Mars and his own spirit, the god Mars, that made Minerva Minerva. And with Mars' permission and absolute acceptance and friendship, well, then that they had a relationship that was close and ultimately really good, really well. Like they loved each other. They had one spirit together to create something good. So Minerva had not had the support of Mars 100%. In fact, they were better than good friends. They were one and the same spirit when it was in her. It was him as her. So it was great. He loved it. She loved it. But the problem was, now this is what we're going to look at here, is what gives Minerva the right to accuse the Trojans of being wrong. Well, because the Trojans had Mars, and the Trojans men had Mars, and that's how they became mighty in battle, was through using Mars as well. And so the common kind of similarity between Mars getting in Trojan soldiers that became heroic, especially Hector. He was epitome of Mars in his greatest strength. Like Hector fought with Mars, not Zeus. And ultimately he may have had Zeus or not had Zeus any time, but more like Hector worshipped Zeus, the father god. So he didn't have him as a fighting element, or even he didn't consider Zeus himself, but he may have considered Zeus in his feelings himself. But he knew better than to think he could be Zeus. Hector would have said, I am not Zeus. Zeus is my god, and I am Mars, and Mars is me, and I am him. And Mars would say yes. And since it is true, it is true. So Hector became a hero because he had Mars. And so when Minerva would accuse all the Trojans of being bad or wrong, it was because she was very aware that the relationship between me and Mars makes me a goddess. Ultimately, then don't say it's not Mars and it is me, and then don't say it's just Mars if it is me either. Because if it's me, even if it is Mars. So she was getting a lot of discredited feelings, that she was being discredited. The Trojans were saying, well, we've already got Mars. He's our god. That's what makes us great. And she's saying, well, that's what makes me goddess. I've got Mars too. And him and I are actually gods and goddesses. And you are trying to discredit me as something so much greater than you, as like you've got some relationship with Mars, but I don't. And exclusively, she was the one who had the relationship with Mars. And in fact, the Trojan men didn't really have a relationship with Mars. Mars was their god, and they were just enjoying his whatever advantage they can get from having him as their god, which was being great fighters that were heroic with the sword and could kill everybody and be like the best. So truly, this was a battle Mars had to stay out of, because Mars would have been like, look, I mean, I love the Trojans too, man. I'm their god, but ultimately they don't respect Minerva, and she's also got me, and she's a goddess because of me. She's using my spirit to be her spirit. So Mars would have said to those Trojans, I don't know how to confront you all. If I'm your god and you're giving me full kudos, then I can't really be upset with you or even tell you did anything wrong, except it's sad that I can't even get involved, because the god Mars couldn't even get involved. He certainly had to stay out of it unless he really wanted to get involved. And he really didn't want to get involved because it was just kind of a bummer that they're not going to respect the goddess. And he's thinking, well, but I'm still going to give them everything if they're going to still have me as their god. And so this was kind of a situation that was really sad in that the Trojans just didn't get it, in the sense that they weren't aware of what I'm telling you right now. Many of the Trojans would never know that the Minerva was a war goddess exclusively using Mars, and that her relationship with Mars was actually the real two, and not that Trojan could take a relationship and say they're equal to their god, in the sense that Minerva shouldn't say she's important or we're not gonna. She didn't. No, she's just using Mars to be a goddess, and Mars is our god, so we're using him too. So how could she be so much better than us? Well, that was their feeling, and many of them would never understand what they were even doing. And that is the sad thing, is that a lot of Trojan men who were very convicting in their heart and their feelings, they would not have a true understanding of anything, not ever aware of any of this. So what they were doing was disrespecting a goddess, and even saying that their relationship to Mars was more sacred than hers, which was not only an insult, but a terrible insult and a crushing blow to her heart and her feelings and her own ego, or sense of whatever her ego could be, which was theirs. She could take their egos and accept it or even hate it, and she would have to hate their ego for making her hate it. And she would say that they made me hate them. They made their own beds to sleep in because they thought they didn't have to know everything. And ultimately it was the lack of knowledge that the Trojan men would want, or even want to know about, that they didn't need to know anything. And in fact, they didn't want to know a lot. You don't need to tell me everything. I know pretty much what I need to know, and you don't need to explain it. And I'm not going to go to school to find out the art of like, what are the energies in a god or goddess, or they didn't know. A lot of them didn't know, and some of them did and wouldn't tell the others. So they didn't share knowledge, to where these men who had these strong feelings didn't know why they were feeling strongly about something, especially when it was against the goddess, and feeling strongly about it. And then understand that what they're really doing is not even knowing why they're feeling strongly against her, when they should realize it's because of the relationship they had with their god, Mars, and that it was not only an offense to her, but they would have to be against her to not feel like they were the offense themselves and guilty and ashamed. It would discredit their own ability to like themselves by either fixing the problem and starting to respect her, or feeling terrible about it as a result of they're being wrong, so they should feel bad about it. They had to become wrong and refuse to feel bad about it. Now that's the part where you need to know, is that if you refuse to change something, you'll feel shamed because you're wrong. And the reason why you would feel ashamed if you're wrong is because you are wrong. It's not because you might be wrong. It's because you're definitely wrong. So the shame you'll feel is because you are actually wrong. Now, if a man feels shame as a first result, there's also feeling shame as a second result. It's a result of intelligence as opposed to feelings, whereas it could be intelligence first and feeling second. And sometimes people feel first and don't want to know any intelligence. So they'll actually take the second form of what they know is, I don't know anything, but I feel pretty strongly. I don't even need to know. And that mistake they make is that can work while you're in a society of men and other men and women, but not when you're having a conflict with the goddesses, because you can't afford not to know what the truth is. And if she would try to tell them, they would certainly not be interested to know. And their feeling that would feel the first shame come on is true shame. It's a shame they feel because they're wrong, actually, and it is true, but they would not know this. And the difference between the first kind of shame you feel and the second kind of shame, which is also shame, well, the second kind of shame you could feel could be from not a goddess coming at you, but it could be from a wife that's not a goddess, or a man that's not a god or goddess. So you could feel shame because someone shames you or puts shame on you or even accuses you in some way. And that kind of shame is not first kind of shame. It's the second kind of shame. It's also just the same kind of shame. If you didn't know this, well, then you'd say, I have a right to not feel ashamed of myself, especially if someone tries to press me or put it upon me and tell me to take it. Be ashamed of yourself. You should be. Well, if a man tried that with you by tricks or head games or mind games, or even accusing you of something, saying you did something terrible, well, then you'd have to fight the shame and refuse to feel it, because it would be the only way you could win. You'd say, don't tell me I'm going to feel ashamed because some dude accused me of something. Well, that's how you'd have to do it. And if a regular woman that wasn't a goddess tried to accuse you of something, well, you might feel ashamed of yourself because of her accusation and also her conviction and her powered spirit. But if she's not a goddess doing it, then it wouldn't be a shame you should accept. It would be a shame you should deny. And so the second kind of shame would be something you need to deny because it's never a goddess coming to you or even a god. Only the first kind of shame will be the god or goddess only. It will never be a person. And so there's two kinds of shame. And then, of course, only the high priest of the temple of Apollo, Helenus, would have ever known this. So it's important to know that how come there's only one man in the whole Trojan? Well, there's very few. There might have been more than one, but there was very few men that would ever be aware of what I've just said. That, in fact, to feel shame come upon myself, well, the natural reaction of all Trojan mentality of men and soldiers is don't put that. No, I'll never take it. I'll never take it ever, not even for a second. I don't care if it's first or second kind. And so the men are already in a strength with Mars, their god. The Trojan men are at a very big disadvantage, and there's really no possibility that things aren't going to go way bad. And how sad the whole war is, and how sad when you start to see all the details of how these men didn't know what they were really doing, except to say that's how sad it is they didn't know what they were really doing. And if they had been just educated to know what they were really doing, then they would have been taught the difference between the first kind of shame, which comes from a god or a deity or a goddess, and that you can't cancel it out unless you want to actually cancel the god or goddess out. That would mean you don't want to praise them or worship them anymore. So then you go worship another goddess, or hope not to offend them for either not worshiping anymore or even offend them because they actually are telling you you're doing something wrong and you better do something about it. Don't try to get rid of the shame when I put it on you. It's not the second kind of shame, it's the first kind. Well, certainly because of the way that a goddess could take advantage of men and trick men, well, it's an obligation that you say, well, I'm not sure even the difference between the two kinds. Then it's kind of like, well, you didn't protect yourself, is what your God would say, because it certainly could be a trick or some a deceitful vice from not a goddess or God. So then, yeah, your advice would be don't accept the shame no matter what. You don't even know the difference between the first kind and second kind. It's not likely coming from a goddess, actually. The chances are very slim that it's coming from an actual deity. So you need to just learn how to ignore the shame and never take it. So don't allow anyone to shame you, especially but you must know if it's a goddess or god that tries to shame you and then you don't take it. Well, then you're not only challenging them, but you're also disrespecting and offending them in real time and utterly and totally. And so then, wait a minute. So they didn't tell them that that in rare cases, the first kind of shame that comes from a deity, well, it's something that if you do deny or won't take, what you're doing is you're going to battle with that goddess or god before they could even go to battle with you. Because first they'll shame you and say, if you want to fight, then go ahead and dare take the shame away. But you'll never hear them say that. That's the tragedy of it, is that you wouldn't dare not feel ashamed if it was put on you when it was actually a god or goddess. But if it was just a person trying to trick you, well, there's lots of them. And in 90% of the cases, that's all it would ever be, is someone accusing you that's not a god or goddess, but thinking they can accuse you on that level. And ultimately, it's not on that level. So it was sad, but understand that Helenus was a personal high priest to the god Apollo, and the god Apollo is not a god of war. Although, yeah, he could be. So yes, he was, but not in the sense that his little brother was. Ares was the god of war. So he says, I got my little brother. In a sense, I can be him, but any more than the older brother is actually the younger brother. Well, yeah, my younger brother's the god of war, and he's no god of the sun, and he's not his dad Zeus either. But I can be the god of war because I can be my little brother if I want to be him, but I'm much more than him, and I'm not my little brother. I'm much more. I'm an older brother, and he's not me, but I can be him. And so I could be the sun god, and then ultimately, because of that, he didn't have like he was wise. Apollo was a god of medicine. He was a doctor, and a lot of his whole entire reason to be the sun god Apollo was not to do with fighting war, except to say that he had that right. Anytime he grabbed his little brother, who don't think would just because he's a little brother that meant anything other than he was still a badass. So he would actually take something else to be the war god, and what he was when he wasn't being taking it was not a war god, and he was a man of medicine and a doctor of doctors. In fact, Apollo was the god of all curing diseases, and also perhaps putting them on people. Apollo gave the Achaeans a plague that killed off thousands of them over 9 days because he would inflict populations with plagues just because they disrespected his high priests, and also because he was mad at them for whatever reason that he felt like he wanted to do it. Apollo attacked people with plagues, mostly populations on many occasions. He was a god that did it exclusively. He also cured disease for that because he was a god of plague causing. He was also a god of medicine because he also wanted to cure what he also killed. Or, if he infected someone with plague, he would want to be able to cure it too. So he'd want to be able to be a doctor better than he was a plaguer. So he was a doctor on much higher of a level than he was ever a plague giver, because he didn't give plagues often, but he was curing people often of all kinds of diseases. And so through Apollo, the sun god, medicine itself came into this world, and it didn't come from really anywhere else. It came from him. And so the sun god was a god of medicine, and all the doctors, even the Hippocratic Oath. So Apollo was a curing one who could cure disease. Helenus learned a lot from Apollo because Apollo talked to him, would come to him, and Apollo loved his high priest. In fact, of all the gods that would give some kind of recognition to their high priests, well, Apollo gave the most recognition, and in the biggest way, because not only did he love his high priest, but he considered them friends of his and would tell them that you're my friend. You are my actual friend. I want you to know that. I'm not just your God. You're my actual friend. And if you actually are right and you're not wrong, then I'm not necessarily needing to be your God, but I'm your friend. And so that was just something they loved and was only shared. Only a high priest of Apollo, the sun god, could actually say, he says he's my friend, that God. Well, I know, but they'd know that, like, that's amazing. Like, we could even consider that. You can't be friends with Zeus. You can't be friends with Ares. Ares would say, you're not my friend. I'm your God. Make sure you never forget that. And Zeus would say, well, that's pretty much what I feel too. Like, don't think that we're friends, although maybe we could be friends, but that's not a word I'll use. Like, I'm your God, and let's use that word. So basically, all the gods were very exact about how they did not be your friend. And it won't happen. Don't even try it. Because if you think you could be friends with God, it certainly won't happen as far as God's concerned, because he doesn't want his followers to think they could be on the same level as him. And friends are on the same level as each other. That's what friendship is. So truly, Apollo would do something with his high priest that truly he was not on the same level as his high priest. They were not on the same level as him. But although he would not actually consider them friends, actually, he gave them some sense of the spirit of, well, you can consider me a friend if you're actually doing everything you're supposed to do, and because I'm going to care about you that much. There was just something only Apollo would ever do, and only the priests of Apollo would ever be able to say that God said that I could be his friend, or we're friends. That just doesn't happen otherwise. So the Helenus, being the high priest, would talk to Apollo, and Helenus was very respectful towards Apollo, as in, like, he knew damn well he was not his friend. He also knew that that Apollo told him that, and he also knew that Apollo didn't really mean it, or if he did really mean it, he was trying to be actually considering his high priest that much, which was ultimately a big compliment that we're not going to be friends. But when I say that, we both kind of know that that just means I'm trying to really be nice, God, saying like I like you a lot. And so he knew that, and he was definitely smart enough to realize that that was the case. That yeah, my God says that we're friends, but we're not, and might say that we're not friends if it's some other God. And so he would talk to Apollo, and Apollo talked to him, and Apollo came many times to the temple to talk to Helenus and would visit with him, and he'd see and hear him. So he would see and hear him. Apollo would show up in a body with a voice, and he appeared from nowhere, and Helenus would be utterly on his knees and respectful, and also just love it. Like, this is the best thing ever happened to me. Like, I get, like, you just came to me, you're talking to me. Yeah. Well, you're my high priest. And ultimately, like, whoa, no one else gets to have this. I get to have this. Like, I love it. Like, thank you. Like, this is the best thing ever happened to me. I always want to be a priest of yours. Everyone else thinks being a priest isn't good, or there's no reward in it. Well, there's no reward in it because you're not going to go around telling people that you're the only one that gets to have a relationship with God, and he'll show himself to you. But truly, that's why it would be ridiculous to think you'd ever even say that to anyone. And he wouldn't. So he'd never be telling anyone. In fact, most people would never even know that the high priest of Apollo would be actually in a personal relationship, and that the God would show himself and be heard and seen from the high priest. And since they didn't know that, they certainly didn't feel like the high priest thinks he's better than them, which could have been a problem. And some of the reason that he might not have told them, plus they shouldn't have known that, because it would put that high priest in a position where people could say, like, he thinks he's better. And he didn't want to be in that position, so he wouldn't be saying anything like that. He wouldn't go tell anyone he talked to Apollo, even though he might want to share it real badly. He certainly would be maybe struggling, saying, I can't share it because they're going to think I'm a big ego, bragging. Right, so then don't. But the reality is that people that need to know how important it is that being a priest is something you want to do, or a privilege that you could have being a priest you didn't even know could be had. And of course, then why even want to be a priest? Well, it would be silly to want to dedicate your life to some God you couldn't see or couldn't hear. But it's not so silly to actually dedicate your life to go to church every week and follow a God you can't see or hear. And the fact that you're not actually dedicated to that God and your whole life dedicated to him would be why you can't see or hear him. And you wouldn't know that. You just dedicate your life to him in a sense that you're not going to exclusively dedicate it to him, right? Well, that'll be why you can hear him and see him, and otherwise why you couldn't. So no one would know that you're saying, if I actually dedicated my life all the way, 100%, I could see the God, which is, yeah. Well, certainly I'm presenting to you that possibility, which would bring the high priest into a much different light. Like, in fact, being a high priest of that God is not only something maybe everyone wants to do now. Who doesn't want to see and hear God? And ultimately, it also opens the door for egotistical possibility and a bad name to be put on. So we don't want to tell people this. We certainly don't want to go teach it people on a regular basis by saying any of this, because we don't want anyone to be able to say the high priest thinks he's better than everyone else just because he has some great relationship. We're gonna not say anything, and then he could get that privilege without becoming something bad to the world, possibly. So they didn't share that information. And truly, the reason why I might share it is because it's important to know that in this whole understanding, that people don't think there's anything special about being a priest that's dedicated. They think that they just must have wanted to do whatever they're doing, but there's many rewards that come with being a high priest of the God and dedicating your entire life to him, and utterly not to anything else. Well, I mean, to just the God himself or herself. And if it's both, God and goddess, well, then it's ultimately what Helenus became, and changed the entire world, because there was no priests of God that would actually be respecting the goddess, really, because Zeus did not see his daughter, the goddess, as an equal. So all that followed Zeus would be tending to look lesser on women. And Mars was getting into soldiers, which couldn't afford to let their heartstrings be played by their wives. So therefore made it impossible for a goddess to pull their heartstrings, which made her mad, and the reason why. So it was a sad affair, the entire Trojan War, because if you see the details and you could read between the lines, it wasn't anybody's single fault that anybody was bad or wrong. In fact, what was bad or wrong was a lack of information sharing between a whole bunch of people, and none of them were bad or wrong. So who was truly at fault, or the one who was the bad or wrong? Well, that's what I'm trying to say here and point out a unique insight. You see, the Trojan War was not about evil and good, and it was not about people who were bad murdering people who were wrong, or just were. And there were nobody was wrong in the Trojan War. There was an absolute catastrophe that took place, and the catastrophe had nothing to do with someone's bad behavior. It had to do with lack of information and not training people to be taught what they needed to know. That in fact, no one wanted to be a high priest of Apollo, except that that's also why he would give them so much greatness and treat them so utterly privately well, which was also a disaster because no one wanted to be a high priest of Apollo, because they didn't think it was even something. What good can you, I don't want to dedicate and sacrifice to some temple, and what am I going to get? A personal relationship with a God where he is my best friend and talks to me every night for a couple hours, hangs out with me? Well, yeah, and he might tell you things that no man will ever know, and that men in fact will never see or even comprehend, which just puts the priest in a place where the priest is really feeling like blessed, happy, and just like the luckiest guy in the world, but only to the God in himself. And then he can't share that with anyone. It's sad. It's a disaster. And if he does share it, it could become an egotistical behavior that he thinks he's better than it. So that priest thinks he's greater than us because he's got some great relationship with God who doesn't talk to us or see us. You see, that was the sad thing, is in the Trojan War, it wasn't about someone was evil and there was any evil participant. There was no one that was evil, and there was no evil participants. Everybody was good. There was no bad people. Nobody deserving to die. What happened? A catastrophe of misinformation and lack of information and refusal to share information, causing different parties to have their feelings hurt, and having their feelings hurt regarding things they didn't understand but could only feel. And also, as a result of defending themselves and their feelings, accusing each other and making accusations, which were sometimes by the god or goddess and were valid accusations. And in many other cases, in fact, more cases, were people either being maybe drunk and making accusations that had nothing to do with deities. Actually, there were people just accusing the accuser. And of course, there was no such thing as the accuser until it showed up, and it showed up in the Trojan War. The accuser was the person who was making an accusation based upon an empty threat of there's no goddess backing that up, and there's no god backing that up either. It's just a man or a woman making an accusation. It would be called the accuser, and eventually form the spirit of what would become whatever it is when it's not the ingredients that exist. And the accuser didn't exist before it did, because there was no accuser. The god was the accuser. And so when the god accuses somebody, well, then the god is the accuser. But then the goddess is the accuser if it's not the god. And they always were the accuser. If they came to you and said you did something wrong, well, if a god or goddess accused you of something, it wasn't something you could fluff off. It certainly wasn't something you could dismiss like a form of shame that you could just say, whatever. Because if you did, well, you were asking to die, actually. And nobody would be dumb enough to do it. In fact, it would be insanity to think anyone would even consider it. They wouldn't consider it. So then how would people start to behave in a fashion like I'm not going to be shamed. You can't shame me, and you can't accuse me. Because if they actually were accused by someone, it wasn't a god or goddess backing them up, well, they wouldn't know that, but they could feel it. So then the lack of their knowledge would cause them to have the courage to go against a god or goddess, to actually go against just a regular accuser who wasn't. Which meant that if you didn't have the courage, then somebody who wasn't even a god or a goddess could not only scare you and own you, but accuse you and also have some charge over you and a victory over you as well. And people this would happen in Troy. Accusers that did not have god or goddess, and they would form a spirit that would begin to become alive. It was the spirit that was not a god or goddess, but actually neither one. And it was the accusing spirit came from men, the spirit of men and women accusing each other in the lack of a god or goddess doing it. It made it invalid, but also a sin of sins, because it was a forbidden behavior to think you could be a god or goddess and make an accusation yourself. I mean, it would truly be that if you don't have a god or goddess and you're making an accusation, well, then it's called an empty threat, an empty accusation. And an empty threat or an empty accusation is a grounds for impersonating a god or goddess. So you'd be in big trouble by the god or goddess just for doing it. But since they didn't even know what they were doing. It was people that were not aware of what they were doing. They felt like, you're accusing me. Well, do you have a god or goddess behind it? Well, what if I do? Well, then I better not dare think I could even challenge it. And what if you do challenge it? Well, I'd say it's your fault I die. And I'd be mad saying, if I challenge it, I'm ignorant. Then if I die, then I'm saying, well, then my ignorance killed me and you didn't tell me. Well, I'm saying that will be the anger of the accuser, who now forms the spirit from them. So let's go back to Helenus. Now that we know what was going on, the accuser would be born in Troy, and it would form its own spiritual essence and become what we know today as the accuser. And you can call it by many names, but it certainly is a real spirit, and it certainly is really real. It's not a god, and it's not a goddess. It is utterly a spirit created from humans, which are real spirits who have gods or goddesses or not. And the important thing to mention is they might have gods or goddesses or not. And we don't know what the accuser has then, because the accuser may not have all of them or not have some of them. And so, but in any event, isn't any one of them. So it'll be coming from the spirit of a person that's not a god or goddess, forming into a mix of two sides that fight. So the accuser is not made from one side that's not the other side. The accuser is made from two sides that fight. And it's a brand new spirit showing up in Troy called the accuser. Now, Helenus would never have that spirit or even talk to it, or probably may have not even known it existed or was coming into existence. But he would be the first man, or absolute case of special case, where something occurred in a temple of Apollo in that whole region of Troy, which was exclusively something rare and unheard of, unique. It was that there was no Apollo that was the goddess too, and there was no the goddess that was Apollo too, other than between the god and the goddess maybe. But through the high priest and the temple of Apollo, Minerva's entrance to reveal herself to Helenus was because she was going to kill and murder every Trojan man, and genocide basically. She was going to extinguish the Trojan race. And ultimately her father's pissed about that, because Zeus is saying, those are my favorite and you want to extinguish them. Well, that's the whole idea, is this was a fight between the gods and goddesses, where Zeus didn't want to extinguish them. He wanted to honor them, is so much they'd honor him. He didn't require they honor her other than as a daughter or a wife. And truly, then she was insisting on being a goddess, and she was not told by her father she's not a goddess, because she's divine from the divine. So how can you say she's not? Well, truly, then he couldn't say that you're not a goddess daughter, but I'm not going to require the Trojans to see you as an equal to me, because you're not. You're my daughter, and I'm your father. So the Trojans would have it would be sad that the Trojans would be good men who were actually good hearts, with good hearts, and the best kind of good men that God himself would actually love the most and give the most respect to. They'd be honored above all other men. The Trojans were uniquely loved by Zeus. And Zeus not only said, these are my best men, these are the best men, and I'm by far the best men. I give them the best of the best. These are top guns of top guns. These are not top guns. These are top guns of top guns. It's like, yeah, then understand, you're going to have a problem, Zeus. You're going to be angry. My daughter's going to insist that she's my daughter. And I'm going to tell her that, well, she's not my daughter, but she'll think then she could be my daughter, and I'm a god. So she's going to try to think she could be my daughter. And that's translating into, she thinks she could be a goddess because she's my daughter and I'm a god. Well, it's true. What am I going to tell her? That you're not my daughter? So she's going to say, then don't tell me I'm not a goddess. And what could her father do? You're right. I can't really say you're not my daughter. So I guess you are a goddess in that sense. But if you want to bring it into this sense, you want to mix with Mars and be strong now, then yeah. Don't expect that I have to get mad at what I consider the best men and the top gun of top guns. Don't consider that I have to tell them they're wrong, because they're going to look at you as a daughter or a wife at best and say they love you and they will care about you, but they're not going to let you be a goddess and tell them what to do. Well, then I'm going to be mad, Dad. They're going to have to recognize I'm a goddess and I can tell them what to do. I'm divine. Well, then understand, daughter, you're going to make me mad, and I might threaten you and hurt you. Well, Zeus did threaten Minerva. So Minerva went to Helenus, and ultimately, because Helenus was a Trojan, he was on the collective of the Trojans. Do you understand? the Trojan collective was being destroyed. It was going to be destroyed because they had to. Well, I'm not saying they had to. Minerva wanted to just kill it, and Zeus knew what she was wanting to do. He was allowing her to, on some level, get away with something that, like, Zeus was too nice, because he should have said, "Daughter, I'll kill you if you want to think you're going to mess with the men I like." Truly, he was saying you could, to some extent, punish them. To some extent, I'll let some of them die. And then Zeus agreed, because his daughter's his daughter. Zeus agreed to to sift the wheat, sift the wheat. He wanted to, Zeus said, "Okay, daughter, since I love you so much, if you're saying some of these Trojans are bad, well, I don't think they're bad, but if you're saying I can't see it from your point of view, daughter, well, I can't." But he said, "Well, if you want to test some of these Trojans, and if there's really bad ones you can find, and I'll look into it, well, then we'll kill some of those bad ones." And eventually he would say, "If you trick Troy into a war, well, I'll really be mad at you." So it was a big problem to have. They didn't kidnap Helen. Actually, the goddesses set that up so Paris would take Helen, and then they could start a war. And ultimately, Zeus was really pissed at Minerva for that, because the whole reason why the war started, it was because Goddess did it. She was deceptive, like the worst kind of deceiving deceptiveness. The goddess wanted to start a war so they could literally either destroy Troy or force it to capitulate by giving demands once the army arrived. So and Zeus was really mad when he heard about that. Like, "Oh my gosh, my daughter did that." And in the story, they don't say that. Ultimately, Helen was a plant to be. She went with him voluntarily. So yeah. Now they'll all be mad and go over there and give him demands. Like, what are the demands the Achaeans would give? Whatever Minerva wanted them to say. So see, Minerva had demands that she wanted the Trojans to absolutely capitulate to, in some sense. And so she did that. Minerva faced the Achaeans, or she faced the Trojans directly and said, like, through their wives. So she would approach a husband through a wife. She possessed the wife, and then the wife would say to her husband, "I've got a goddess with me, and she's here, the Minerva, and she wants you to listen to her." And they'd be like, well, I mean, they wouldn't listen to her as anything more than the daughter, wife. And so she had demands, Minerva did, and the Trojans didn't take her demands or even want to recognize her demands. And then Zeus said that, yeah, she shouldn't make demands. She should be happy with what she has. So she said, "Okay, well, then I have to make demands, and I don't even know how to make demands on the Trojans. What do I do?" Start a war. First of all, piss off, have Paris think that he has got a new wife, and then she'll go with him voluntarily, because the goddesses will make Helen do it, because the goddesses tell Helen, "Yeah, go with him, because yeah, we're going to start a war." But maybe they told her, maybe they didn't. Ultimately, that Helen went over there, and it was all planned Minerva's. So yeah, and when the war starts, and now the whole Achaean army is going to be on your butt, on your front doorstep. Yeah, because you stole my wife, it's going to say Menelaus, and my brother's going to back me up. You're going to cause a huge war. Well, who did it? Minerva started it. Why? Because she had demands already on the Trojan men and society, absolute demands, and none of them would take her demands and even recognize them. They said, "Sorry, you don't have demands. You can't make demands, Minerva. We got your dad." She said, "Well, I'm going to find a way to make demands on you, and you're going to find a way to capitulate to him." "Well, how's that?" "Well, when the war starts and we've got the whole Achaean army and the Danaans on the front doorstep, I'll have some demands for you." "Okay, good. Well, I guess you'll have to get them over here first." See, so that's what happened. And Helenus was a man who respected Minerva. When she went to him at the temple, he treated her with 100% respect and admiration, and was privileged to see her presence. And he felt lucky, the luckiest guy in the world. So she was shocked, because it wasn't just that she could force a man to love her, or even accept her presence as being something good, but she did not expect that he was having a daily visit with God Apollo. See, Helenus really appreciated his privileges with Apollo. He couldn't tell people, and he really wanted to share, like, how awesome he felt like as a special high priest. But Apollo told him, "You can't share this stuff with people, because they're going to say you're an ego that thinks you're better than them now, because they're going to feel like, oh no, I can't see the God, but he can." And so ultimately he knew this, and he was also feeling like, damn, I could never really share how great I want to feel. Well, right, you can't be an ego, really, not unless you're going to cause yourself to be looked at as one. You can't tell people this. This is a privilege between me and you. he still loved it and was glad. He still wanted it and didn't need to tell anybody really. Although that could have been fun, egotistically speaking. But he didn't. He knew the problem it could create. He didn't want a label on himself because he wasn't an ego. He could be an ego, but his brothers were, so he could do it, but he didn't want to do it. He really wasn't the ego. He was the high priest of the god Apollo. So he absolutely thought he was the luckiest guy in the world to have Apollo come to him, talking to him all the time. He felt like he knew he was the only one that Apollo said, "You're the only one that's going to see me." And the other high priest, "I won't show myself to anyone." He thought that was awesome. I'm so glad I'm a high priest. It's the best thing I ever wanted to do. It was my dream come true. Well, okay, but you're the only one that shares that feeling. That was good enough for him. And when Minerva came to him, she didn't realize that literally the privilege he had that he loved so much and felt so special about was why he respected her so much. Because the only thing better than having a god coming to you, being your best friend, was a goddess showing up. And maybe could be your friend too if she would. Well, he certainly didn't know what she was going to do when she first showed up, but he certainly knew also that he was lucky enough not just to have the sun god as his friend, but here comes Minerva, and he didn't know if she was going to be his friend or not. But when she showed up, she was nice as far as she was being not a threat to. He didn't feel a threat because she wasn't considering him a threat yet. She wanted to find out. He was so happy to see her and so thankful in his heart, and so just so beside himself, like so lucky to like I get to actually like, you're a goddess, like you're the goddess Minerva, like, oh yeah, I am the goddess. I'm like, she came to him like almost mad, like, she wasn't mad, but she was feeling the anger of like, no one even recognized me as a goddess, and your brothers won't even see me that way. But he hit the floor and he bowed to her with every ounce of his spirit, and he was just beside himself and feeling lucky. Now I've got a god and a goddess that talk to me. And ultimately she's just like, whoa, you're not like any of your brothers. They wouldn't even think that my presence was anything more than a nuisance, or that they should have to give some of their attention to a daughter or their wife when they're busy men and they don't have time. She's saying, this is a man who gives me something I want. She's like, I'm blown away. It's exactly a man who will give her exactly what she wants. And like, but she's getting, wow. And he's a Trojan that's doing it. The only one that is. And maybe there's a couple more that are doing it somewhere in there, but not in the story or even that I'm aware of. It may be that he was actually the only one that actually did it. Now, because of that, it was now a man who was having a god and goddess together. And that was not really anything ever heard of, because you either had a goddess and you were probably a woman who worshiped the goddesses, or you were a man who worshiped the gods. And then you could be a man that worshiped more than one god, or all three gods, or just one of the gods, because you exclusively don't deny any of them, but might like one of them more than the other. People who wanted to be fighters and were drunk alcoholics who got blamed for stuff and were probably not the greatest men, but big egos, well, they always wanted to have Eris as their god. And Eris would tell them, you can feel important. I am a god. And he was. So truly, yeah, men that didn't really want to get it right and didn't want to include women could have Eris. And then, of course, if they wanted to step up to the plate and have his older brother Apollo, the sun god, well, there are men that could be like egotistical, but were more designed around technology, medicine, wanting to be men that could change the world, and were concerned about not being their ego necessarily, although they could do it, and would do it, but would not do it and say, I don't feel like doing it right now, because it's ultimately something different from Eris. It's Apollo's sun god. And so Helenus had all the versions of not really Eris, in the sense that he had Eris because he respected Eris. So he certainly didn't say that I don't have Eris. He said, I do have Eris, and I'm going to make a point to say I have Eris, because since I wouldn't take Eris, I'm going to say Eris is a god and give him all the importance, because he was used to giving kudos to everybody. And he would have known, Helenus would have known, that he cannot say that Eris is less than the other gods. He would have been he wouldn't have wanted to offend him. He would have said that Eris is just as good of a god as anyone else. And don't say that just because I'm Apollo's high priest, that I'm not really Eris's high priest, because if I'm not, well, I could be if I'm his brother's high priest and his brother says so. And so ultimately he's saying, I'm not going to insult the god of war, but you might think I like him, or even that I'm his high priest as well. And I'm not going to say I'm not, because I'm going to make sure I don't say it. I'm not going to offend the god of war. It's a good idea. And Apollo would tell him, that's good, because you don't want my brother thinking that you think that he's not really a god, or not a god that should be recognized as one. And it would be an insult to him not to absolutely protect him in some sense. So Apollo said, you can't look at my little brother, even though we both know what he is. He's a god that is not getting it right. And ultimately, then I can't see it that way. Yeah, Apollo would tell Helenus, you need to be so careful with how you view the god of war, because you don't want to offend him. And ultimately, I don't want you to offend him, but you are so much better than him and higher than him that he might think that you think you're greater than him. And of course, that could be a problem too, that the high priest of the sun god has to give that respect to that god of war, or else he could be not only accused of thinking he's a god, or trying to be better than him, or thinking he's better than him. Yeah, so he was aware of this. Helenus was very much aware that he could not take credit from anybody. And that also was why he gave so much credit to Minerva, because he was already used to knowing that. Apollo had told him that all the gods need to have the respect, even when they're fighting, that you can't possibly think, because you're a high priest of mine, that I'm better than any of them. And you have to be on guard to tell yourself, do not allow your feelings to feel it. And they will feel without you needing to know anything. So it's very careful. He had to practice, like he had to be told this. He had to practice, like do chants and stuff that like I consider all of them equal, because I'm the high priest. And so I can never be accused. And I'm also going to be loved, doing it right all the time, never to make a mistake. And Apollo carefully taught his high priest never to make a mistake, how to look good in the eyes of all the gods and never give them a chance to accuse you, or make sure you don't offend him by accident too. So he told him everything that he has to do to not accidentally offend him. So he knew what to do when Minerva came in. And the thing is he didn't do it because he had to do it. He did it because he was absolutely honored to have her presence. And now she says, wow, you're something like, so you're not a Trojan. Well, of course I'm a Trojan. Well, you're not on the collective of the Trojans. Well, yes, I am, but I'm also a priest of High Apollo. So I can shift from the collective out of it into something else. But I'll be back into it anytime. And so it's like, well, she's like, okay, so, but I say that's not a Trojan. They can't shift out of it. You won't see Troy or the Trojan soldiers ever shifting out of their mentality. They're always in it. So this was a unique something that he could do only, or yeah, it was ultimately because Apollo taught him how to do it. And so she was impressed with him, but more so she liked him immediately when she saw him. She said, you are a Trojan I like. Oh, I learned something as a goddess. I just learned something that I didn't know. I didn't think any of you were good. Well, ultimately there might be more of us that are good, but he would ultimately be told by her the same thing. He would know, he would also gather through talking to Apollo the whole story. So he would be absolutely informed of everything about what was going on. And so before they sacked Troy and they were going to do it, she went to make an exclusive kind of an investigation to find out, I don't want to kill any innocent Trojans. I'm going to find out if there's any more in there that don't deserve to die. And if there's any Trojans that don't want to give me some recognition or won't give me respect, or they're going to say they could be their god, but they're not going to recognize me. Well, she's going to kill all of Troy. They're all going to go down. And so immediately she already had plans to save Helenus, because she didn't want Helenus to die. Utterly, she was impressed by him. She didn't want him to die, and neither did Apollo, and she wasn't so concerned with what Apollo thought. So isn't that unbelievable? See, Minerva wouldn't have really cared what Apollo thought, and she might have cared if like he came to her and said like that's my high priest, don't screw with him, and he might have said that. But the reality is that she wouldn't be concerned unless Apollo beseeched her to do it, you know. But the reality is that she actually was on her own willful intent to be considering that Trojan as the most important man she knows, including more important than any Achaean, any Danaan, and any Trojan, which meant that she put him on the high pedestal and said, we can't let him die, because he's got me, and he's definitely yeah, that's why we're killing all these people and having conflicts, because they don't got me or won't have me. And the ones that, so I'm going to save him. I'm going to make sure that he gets saved. So if there's a chance a Trojan spirit can come back to me and I accept it, well, it won't be through anybody who's not Trojan. It'll have to be through someone who was Trojan or is Trojan, and I'm about to kill them all. So there won't be any left unless he's the only one. And then, he'll create a Trojan mentality that could have me, that I don't need to extinguish and have the Trojan War because of. So what was Helenus? Well, instantly the rescue of Helenus was on, and it was a need to know that Minerva herself was now making it her point to get him out of there before. So she came to him and said, you're going to be going to the market next week, and you're going to get kidnapped, and ultimately he was told by her one night, you're going to get kidnapped next week, and they're going to show up and kidnap your ass. They're going to come out with weapons when you're on your way to so-and-so, and you just need to stand still and don't fight, and just hold your hands up and let them take you. And you're going to think they're going to kill you when they come at you. They're not going to kill you. They're going to take you prisoner, and you're going to be taken in, and this prisoner, we're going to take you away. And ultimately, what for? This place, this Troy, is about to be sacked, and every man will die. Every baby will die. Every baby boy will be thrown off the walls. There's no Trojans that will ever. And it's like, can you imagine how hard it was for Helenus to have to deal with this? The goddess is telling him, I'm going to kill all your brothers. Your dad's dead. Your brother, every one of your brothers is dead. All your sisters, well, many of them will die. In fact, it's so sad that this has come down to this. You know how hard it was for him to think, like, what can I do to help this? Well, you're going to die too. But what you can do is follow my directions and do as I tell you. What do you want me to do? Well, you can tell your brothers and sisters one last time over the dinner table that Troy will fall and every one of them will die. I've already told him that like 50 times. Hector thinks I'm his younger brother and I'm a nuisance. He doesn't want to give me his, like, he thinks if he has to give me his attention for a minute, it's ultimately hard for him to do. Like, because if I talk too long, he'll say, like, like, okay, man, like, what do you want? Like, he doesn't really listen to me. They're not listening to me. Well, I know. How many times did you tell him? 47 times, 47 dinners. I told him, we're all going to die, Dad, brother. We're going to die. You understand? We'll be dead. Dead, like, is in shh. And they're saying, well, if you're not okay with yourself, ultimately, Helenus he tried to tell him. He utterly tried so many times, and he was dismissed. It was like an offensive dismissal, like you're just a younger brother. You don't know much. You're just a kind of do you know that Hector didn't know that his little brother Helenus talked to the god Apollo himself, and that Mars, when Mars got into Hector, it became Hector himself. So Hector could not experience anything like a relationship with his god on any other level than it became himself. It became himself. So, like, if Hector can experience his god in him, well, it was him. So he didn't really have any relationship with anything that wasn't himself. Hector would take his god upon himself as himself and be like, I am a mighty god. So then, wait a minute. How did Hector experience his god? Well, he didn't experience his god. He experienced himself both when he had that god and when he didn't, and it was the same him to himself. Hector didn't know the difference between when he had Mars in battle and was almighty, or when he was sitting in his living room and didn't have Mars, and so doesn't need to have Mars, and he still felt pretty almighty. So Hector couldn't tell the difference between himself when it was his god and himself as himself, or if it was later on when he didn't have his god in himself, at least not at that moment. He still was himself and felt exactly the same as when he had his god. So Hector could not perceive that his god was even real, except to say that his fighting ability made him think, if anything, that, well, I think he is real, and ultimately that's why I'm who I am, the greatest fighter ever. So Hector could ultimately be egotistical, thinking he is a god. Of course, he wasn't like that. He knew better. He knew he was not God, but he also knew he was getting the power of God. He didn't know how to have a relationship with a God that was separate from himself. So he would have to talk to himself as himself to talk to God. It was like, I don't see God, I only see me. And Hector thought that Helenus probably experienced the same thing, because Helenus couldn't share the fact that he got to talk to Apollo, the sun god, actually every night. And it was like his friend. Well, Hector had no idea about that. If Hector had known, he would have listened to Helenus. Helenus couldn't tell him, because at that time, that was partly why the whole Troy went down. So I want to give you one of the actual pieces of information, share with you that why it was only one reason that was a main significant factor, is that no one knew that Hector and Priam didn't know that their son had a better, closer relationship with the sun god Apollo than they could ever dream of. And they would dream of it if they could have it, if they even knew that it was actually why he wanted and loved to be a high priest so much. They actually thought that their son decided to dedicate his life to the high priest, to Apollo, and that he was just being kind of like well, I mean, what do you really get when my little brother wants to be a high priest? I don't see what's so great about that. He probably does sacrifices. He probably talks to his God like I do. It's just himself in his head, right? No, his God comes in a different body, and it's a different entity, and it's actually his God. It's not him. It's actually a God that's so much greater than him. He couldn't fathom that it could be him, because it's not him. Well, so then wait a minute. So you're saying that, like, I could actually look at God as something that is not me? Well, yeah, Zeus is you too, but not you too. Hector couldn't appreciate that being a high priest could be so great. He thought it wasn't so great. My brother should have been a soldier like me. The thing is, my brother decided to be a priest. Well, I don't really know why he did it, but yeah, my feeling is like, if you really want to do it, little brother, you want to go do sacrifice at the temple, and it's kind of silly to me. I'd rather have a God and be the man. Well, then understand where Hector went wrong and what happened there. Hector would dismiss his own little brother Helenus when they were at the dinner table, and when Helenus was delivering an actual message from the goddess herself, and was the actual key factor in instilling the peace that would cause the nation of Troy to either be dead and gone, or not die and not ever have to be gone. And ultimately, when he sat at that dinner table, he felt the importance of what he was representing and was aware of every part of what was going on. But yet his brother Hector, who was greater than him, better than him, and would become the next king of Troy, he was only a high priest, but his brother Hector was a king of Troy, and his father Priam was the king of Troy. Those two guys were ignorant. Well, that's what he would eventually say, and he would dare not use the word. But long after Troy was been sacked and all the babies killed, including Hector's son, thrown off the wall, because what they didn't want to have the kind of behavior that men would have, dismissing the divine feminine, and ultimately they were the most highest, purest form of divine masculine by itself, which meant that the Trojans weren't wrong, and they were the best part of what offended Minerva, and so therefore they shouldn't have had to die for being the best of the best. But then, because Helenus couldn't tell his brother or his father that you don't even know your relationship with your God. In fact, you just think it's talking to yourself, and so you're disappointed that in fact your God won't show up before you as something separate, because that could happen. They were very much aware that a God could come to you as some other form, but in your head. And so if a God wanted to actually show up, that was considered an important event. It almost never happened. So you had to be good enough to think like, I'll talk to God in my head and hope it's actually him, because some men would do it and it's not. Helenus would try to do something at the dinner table to tell his brother and his father, you don't understand that, like, we will all die. And it may be that I won't die, that you'll be dead, brother. Dad, you're going to be dead. I'll feel like I might as well be dead. But he couldn't tell him that, because he couldn't even dare say that that it might have been knowing that he's going to be the one to survive. And that last dinner that he had, you can call it the Last Supper. The Last Supper he had with his dad and his brother. Well, Minerva already told him, I'm going to kidnap you. You're going to be getting arrested. So you need to go to market on the weekend. And when they come at you with weapons, just hold your hands up and don't move. Okay. And we're taking you out of here, and you're going to be king of the land someday. You're going to be a king over many lands. That's what you tell him. You will not die, and you will survive. In fact, you will be the next version of what some society could be that actually has me the way I like it, or I accept it, And ultimately he's like, and I have no other choice. We've tried everything for 10 years. There's no other choice, and you will die too, and I don't want you to die. So he would leave. He would get kidnapped and leave, but he'd have the Last Supper with his brother and his father, and he felt so bad, trying to tell him that we're all going to die. And he couldn't tell him that he's going to get kidnapped. He knew he was going to leave. He knew he was going to be disappearing. He wanted to kind of say goodbye to him, but he was trying to give him one last warning, and they dismissed him. Hector was too proud of his god Mars, and he couldn't see his brother. He couldn't feel the conviction of his brother's warning as anything but a kind of a little panic of my brother. He's just kind of a little brother that panics too much. He doesn't know how to control his own emotions. Hector, that's a fatal flaw right there, man. He's your little brother. He doesn't want to control his emotions. He knows what's going to happen. If you don't consider that he has some validity here, you don't want to look at him as your little brother who doesn't know how to control his emotions yet, because he's not as in control of himself as you. That's why you're going to dismiss this whole warning, that he can't be like you delivering the message. He's not you. So if he could have, Helenus would ultimately feel like a terrible disappointment in himself. If he could have delivered the message as his older brother, calm and collected, it might have actually stuck. But because he was being the little brother that was more like in a panic, he dismissed it as he's not truly can possibly be giving me a message from actually the deities. Well, I mean, he didn't actually think that. He actually felt that. So he dismissed it. And then Troy would be all destroyed. And the babies thrown off the wall. Troy's son would be thrown off the wall. They would all be killed off on purpose, because Goddess would say, you cannot exist if you're not going to recognize me as something. And ultimately then Zeus would have his wrath in his day after that. See, after the Trojan War happened, it was time for Minerva to pay her price. And I just want to tell you that I'm not going to talk about that story. It's not even in the mythology because maybe they don't want to talk about it. She certainly would pay a high price, that goddess, for doing what she did and causing Zeus's favorite men and his choice of who is his top gun of top guns. Well, yeah. When Troy was sacked, Zeus was mad, and then he would take out his next wrath on his own daughter, and that would be a story in mythology you'll never hear about because it's a story that's too disturbing to know. And Helenus would be king over many lands. Helenus would be a king over many lands. First, he'd spend a long time being a prisoner, and then he'd be with the prisoners. Some say that he gave all the information away to actually take Troy down. But the story I have is not that he got captured and then had a chance to tell on Troy. The story I got is that he only could tell on Troy after it was already sacked because he got kidnapped like after the Last Supper he had with his dad, and then basically Troy only had a week left anyways, so it wasn't like he could go get captured by people and give him any information anyways. They'd still want information from him, and they'd have much interrogating to do as a prisoner, even after Troy was sacked. But if in the story, if it was that he did get caught first and gave information away, well, you could have looked at him as a traitor or the reason why Troy fell, because it was the Helenus who the goddess rescued, or he got kidnapped and that little brother gave information to how to get to go ahead and steal the palladium from Athena's temple was what he told them. And so Odysseus did it based upon what Helenus under interrogation, based upon what he told Odysseus and the other Achaeans. Well, that could have been the reason why Helenus could have been the traitor of Troy and the reason it fell, because he told him how to get into it and incapacitate its magical ability to protect itself. And ultimately, what you need to know is that you could also look at him then as the reason why the Trojan horse and the reason why Troy fell. In fact, you could look at him as a traitor or the worst character of all, or the little brother that told on his dad and he was a high priest that told, Troy fell because of him. No, not because of him. Troy fell because Minerva said it's going to fall. And he was rescued by Minerva because she wanted him to live. And she certainly didn't want to kill him or him to die. But the rest of them had to die. So when you realize this, what you'll find is Helenus would think like people would label him as a traitor. And they certainly say you're the reason why you backstabbed and betrayed your brothers and your dad's, like, people could actually accuse him of that. And he knows it because he does know that he told and said what he did because of what was the truth, that the goddess Minerva was angry and that she also was not totally right either. And that was be a lot of hardship that he had to go through when he was trying to help everybody and not be bad and wrong. And he didn't backstab his brother or father. It was that he escaped and might have told him that you have to take the goddess away from the temple. So understand why he told him that. If you take the goddess away, then the whole Troy will be sacked. He told him if the goddess disappears from Troy, if you take the Athena away from the Palladium, or if you take the Palladium in the temple of Athena away from the temple of Athena, the Palladium is Athena, a statue of Athena herself. He said, if you take Athena and take her away from the temple and out of Troy, that means the goddess is gone. So this is quote unquote what he said to him. That means the goddess is gone and there is no goddess in there anymore. And if the goddess disappears from Troy and there's only Trojan egotistical men, then it will be sacked and destroyed and every baby thrown off the wall. Those are my nephews. So they knew that they could do it. So in the story, they did do it. They went and stole the goddess from him. Understand that they didn't want the goddess anyways. So those Trojans said, well, we got the palladium stolen from the temple. Someone stole our palladium from the temple. That was a test. The Trojans as a whole said, well, that wasn't even important. So the palladium got stolen, big deal. And understand whatever the metaphor behind it was, I can't see it all. I could tell you that the goddess set it up that way. That's why he said that, because he was telling them if the goddess is no longer within you, then your wives are slaves and nothing more. And your wives are enslaved to your husbands and nothing more or less. if the goddess is gone, then the spirit of the woman's integrity and self-love for her own self is gone, and her importance will be gone, her self-importance will be gone. If you take away the goddess, then you're going to take away the self-importance of every woman. And that will mean that she'll be against her husband and everything will go wrong. In fact, the one thing you can consider that you cannot take away is the goddess herself, that she must be the one ingredient that's within everything, or you are all destroyed and will be just nothing more than the result of complete catastrophic destruction. And it will be on purpose and with the purpose, and the gods and goddesses themselves will be the ones who will be doing it. And that's it. Helenus was a hero to me. He also happened to be my grandfather. And as much as you want to make that hard to believe, I actually found the link on Ancestry.com, and they warned me that it was a mythological grandfather. If you think that you could find a link on Ancestry.com, and it's why would they even provide a link that actually told me about my grandfather, and then also a warning that said it's a mythological grandfather, because this is a not really real link. Why did Ancestry.com provide a not real link to me and tell me it's not real because it's mythological in origin only? Well, they did give me the link, and I read the warning, and I also was blown away to think that that's even possible that they would do it. And I thought, why would they do it? I mean, it's kind of strange that they would actually provide a link and try to tell me my grandfather was Helenus, high priest to Apollo, because they did, and they provided the link. I didn't make it up or create it. So it was actually Ancestry.com helping me. And so that's what I'm going to share, is that was actually, my grandfather was Helenus, and I already knew that. The goddess told me this. She told me this before I found it on Ancestry.com, and then she also told me on Ancestry.com that it was he was my grandfather, and so did Ancestry.com say that. So I thought that was strange that they would provide a mythological link to me and then give me all the details within it, and there was a lot of details within it. So what does that mean? Well, yeah, he was for real, and so am I. And ultimately, it is hard to believe. All right, I'll see y'all later.